Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's program. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items that I wanted to review. First off, we have a really fun fundraiser coming up on Wednesday, March 23rd, JHSM Eats. Enjoy dine in or carry out at Steve's Deli, and a portion of the profits from the day will be donated to JHSM. On April 12th, we have another Zoom lecture, American Anti-Semitism, an Old Problem Returns with Pamela Nadell. And on April 25th, we have an in-person presentation at Beth Am Synagogue, The Women of Copper County, which will be a book discussion and virtual presentation. Tonight's program is supported by the Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs and the National Endowment for the Arts, and very specially the Center for Jewish Studies at Eastern Michigan University. If you'd like to sign up for any of our upcoming programs, please feel free to scan the QR code that is on your screen right now, and it will direct you right to our website, or visit jhsmichigan.org/calendar. Again, before we get started, just a reminder that all questions this evening, we will be having a question answer session at the end of the presentation. So please submit your questions via the chat feature on your Zoom screen, and I will be moderating that conversation. This evening, we are very lucky to have with us Ashley Johnson Bavery, who is an assistant professor of history at Eastern Michigan University and author of the book Bootlegged Aliens, Immigration, Politics on America's Northern Border, which was the winner of the 2021 First Book Award from the Immigration and Ethnic History Society. She will be talking to us about unauthorized immigration in Jewish Detroit. And without further ado, let me hand it over to Ashley Johnson Bavery.
Thank you so much. Great. I just want to make sure everything's working. Thank you so much, Kara, for that introduction, and to the Jewish Historical Society of Michigan for inviting me to give this talk. And of course, thank you so much for coming out on Zoom to see the talk as well. So I'm going to share my screen now to show you. Okay. All right. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history and themes of from my book, which was recently published with the University of Pennsylvania Press. And its main goal has been to contextualize and historicize the immigration debates that we see in the news today, and particularly those that focus on undocumented or unauthorized immigration. So today we see politicians and pundits often casting certain certain immigrants, usually those from Mexico and Central America, as undesirable or unauthorized. In particular, former Attorney General Jeff Sessions claimed to have no problem with immigrants, but wanted newcomers to wait their turn, like his European ancestors did. And so this talk, and today I'm going to kind of show you talk a little bit about the idea that Europeans represented the legal immigration of the past is actually false. And actually, in 1921 and in 1924, the US established restrictive quotas that kept thousands of Europeans out of America. So by 1920, by the mid-1920s, the undocumented immigrants on everyone's minds were people from Poland, people from Italy, and people from Russia as well. And huge numbers of these immigrants who are coming in are Jewish. And they could have been your parents or grandparents, and many of them crossed the US-Canada border in Detroit, where many of them helped build the automobile industry or other industries across the city as well. So I'll begin here. I would like to begin talks with the story of an immigrant. And I don't have a picture of this. Sometimes I have a picture of different people. I don't have a picture of this particular immigrant to show you, but I'll just show the line. This is the immigration line at the Windsor Detroit ferry in 1921. So these are people waiting in line to come in legally. But I'll start with the story of a man named Isaac Chernin. And on July 12th, 1926, Isaac Chernin celebrated his 25th birthday in a small Russian farm town, and he applied for a visa to the United States. But in 1924, 2 years before Chernin's request, the US Congress had passed immigration quotas that were meant specifically to limit the number of Southern and Eastern Europeans allowed into the nation. And this was specifically meant to curb Catholic and Jewish immigration into the United States. So this meant that only 2,248 Russians would be granted legal entry into the United States each year. And that Chernin, who is a Jewish peasant with no power or connections, really stood next to no chance of receiving a visa. So instead of the United States, Chernin boarded an ocean liner to Canada, a nation that at this time was encouraging immigration. And he was hopeful that America's northern neighbor might offer a better chance and a better future. But once in Canada, Chernin still yearned for the money and stability he imagined that only the United States could offer. And so after 9 months working odd jobs in Toronto's immigrant community, he heard rumors that there were waves of circumventing America's strict new immigration quotas. So, eager to find a stable job, he boarded a train to Windsor, Canada, and sought the help of a Bulgarian-American smuggling ring to enter the United States illegally. And so in Windsor at this time, there were a bunch of smuggling rings and people who would go around and would go into boarding houses that immigrants frequented, would go into different factories that immigrants tended to work in, and would advertise their services and say, we can get you across if you want to go to Detroit. And they would say, we can get you a job in Detroit. We can kind of facilitate your life when you get to Detroit as well. So this was becoming a major business in Detroit at the time. So in Windsor, so the smugglers charged him $125 and they supervised every step of his journey. In Windsor, a local man ushered Chernin, a Lithuanian, and 3 Greek men into a small boat and rowed them across the Detroit River under the cover of darkness. Once on shore, an awaiting taxi charged $3 to drive each immigrant to the center of Detroit, and the driver dropped Chernin in the heart of Detroit's Jewish Hastings Street neighborhood and referred him to a local boarding house that specialized in lodging recent arrivals. So after a few days, Chernin found work sweeping the floors of Henry Ford's Highland Park automobile factory. So working for one of America's most important and famous companies, he really thought that he'd made it. He really felt he'd, here we see, this is Highland Park. And however, life in Detroit came with its own struggles. So I'm sure you know that in 1914, Henry Ford famously offered $5 a day, but this did not apply to all workers. Because he had no papers, Chernin made $1 to $2 a day. And if he demanded more money or better hours, his foreman could notify local immigration authorities and have him hauled off for a deportation hearing. On his way to work every day, Chernin saw graffiti urging him to leave the city and keep America for the Americans. And there was also graffiti, he notes, that would say expel the criminal foreigners. So there's this association developing between new immigrants and crime in particular. But Chernin kept his head down and managed to live in the shadows of American industrial life for a couple of years. I was going to show you this is the KKK in Detroit in the 1920s. And here, I'll come back to them and talk more about the Klan, but this is a Klan rally on the outskirts of Detroit in 1926. Chernin's living in these shadows of industrial life and kind of staying away from immigration authorities, trying to keep his head down. But 2 years after his arrival, a policeman stopped him on the street one day, demanded his papers, and sent him to the Immigration Bureau for questioning. By the summer of 1929, local authorities sent Chernin on a deportation train to New York, where he boarded an ocean liner back to Europe. So he was deported back to Russia. So today, I'll draw on the stories of immigrants like Chernin to talk about how severe and restrictive and discriminatory immigration restrictions shaped America's relationship to foreigners, and today I'll focus on how they affected Jewish foreigners in Detroit and Jewish Americans as well. Detroit at this time, here we go. Detroit is a city that the Secretary of Labor called the illegal capital of America and the Ellis Island of the Midwest. So here, new policies combined with coercive enforcement to link certain Europeans to crime and make xenophobia a permanent part of the law. And this brings me to my second kind of larger point, which demonstrates that in industrial Detroit, automobile manufacturers avoided and sometimes even benefited from inconvenient immigration laws by advertising work in their Windsor factory branches and employing workers like Chernin who did not have papers. And so this system foreshadowed a later trend, which we perhaps know, in which employers on the US-Mexico border thwart border laws by building border factories and encouraging undocumented immigration. So in both the 1920s and today, despite the fact that undocumented workers perform necessary work, their presence in America has been deeply troubling to a range of policymakers, unions, and native-born citizens. And here we have, so we're going to look basically at an alternate story to this history, right? This is the history of the picture many people imagine when they talk about European immigration. They think of their ancestors filing through Ellis Island, perhaps being submitted to a literacy test, having to pass a health exam, a health screening, pay a head tax, and coming into New York and then making their way to cities across the United States, to Chicago, to Detroit, to other industrial centers, even as far as California eventually. So today I'll be looking and talking a little bit about kind of an alternative story in which some of these Europeans are actually coming through without papers. All right, so let's begin by looking at the 1924 Immigration Act. I always like to put the quotas up here because it just gives you an idea of who's being excluded and for what who's being kept out and what their numbers are exactly. So we all, of course, know the story of immigration through Ellis Island, right? But after World War I, the number of Eastern Europeans coming to the United States spiked. And many policymakers began to argue over what to do about the threat new immigrants posed to Anglo-Saxon America. And in response to this, they devised this quota system. So this is based, and the quotas were based on 2% of America's immigrant population in 1890. So they used the 1890 census, and they chose the 1890 census. They chose this quota system, and they decided to choose a census system because they wanted the quotas to appear fair. The policymakers who enacted this were worried that if the quotas did not appear fair, then they would be easier to overturn and easier to challenge from groups like the ACLU, which was ready to challenge quotas from the beginning. And they chose 1890 in particular because it was the last year before Southern Eastern Europeans began coming to the United States. So they had access to the 1900 and could have probably pulled out the 1910 census for the quotas, but they chose 1890 specifically because they were the quotas they liked the most. And they said, policymakers, Senator Johnson Reed, who was one of the person that introduced the bill in the Senate, specifically said that that the 1890 census was the census in which quotas were the numbers were the most secure and most realistic, but really it was the numbers that he preferred for the makeup of the United States. So Senator David Reed said that specifically that he wanted to maintain the Nordic integrity of America. Representative Albert Johnson who introduced the bill in the House, said the Poles, Austrians, and the nationals of the different Russian states who apply for visas are the most undesirable type of immigrant. So they're very specific about who they're trying to keep out. So basically anyone that's not British or old stock immigrant is cast as undesirable. And it's specifically in the debates, they talk specifically about how they want to keep out Catholics and most of all Jewish immigrants from coming to the United States. So here you can see the quotas here, and you see the huge disparity between Northern and Southern Europe. And it's important to note also that Asians are not on here because they're completely barred from the United States under the new quota law. So these different groups get very small quotas. The Middle East, everyone there gets a quota of 100. And then again, so Poland's quota is just under 6,000, which was very little considering in the years before this, 1 to 200,000 Poles have been coming to the United States each year. Here we see for the first time these racist and nativist ideas against Europeans being written into the law. So Asians had been and Chinese had been barred starting in the 1880s and 1890s, but here we see this really affecting Europeans. And in response, the American Jewish community opposed the quotas vehemently. The American Jewish Congress and the B'nai B'rith International called upon Congress to dismantle restrictive quotas. The Novoye Ruske Slovo, a Russian Jewish publication with the national circulation of 700,000, claimed that quotas would divide America into Class A citizens who are native born and Class B citizens who are born on the wrong side of the Atlantic. So you really see this idea coming out in which Jewish Americans see that if quotas are put in place, then it's going to cast their groups as undesirable. You see similar lobbies coming from Italian Americans and a few other groups, but Jewish Americans are very concerted in their protests to these quotas. The quotas affect Jewish Detroit in particularly quite a lot. So many Jewish immigrants headed to New York City, of course, but a growing number had started to settle in Detroit by the 1910s. Detroit had always had a small core of established German Jewish immigrants who worked in business across the city. And there were about 1,000 of them by 1900, but by the early 1920s, 50,000 Russians, 78% of whom were Jewish, came to Detroit. And once in Detroit, they settled along Hastings Street in the Black Bottom neighborhood, which is a region that would soon be reserved for African Americans from the South. But in the 1910s and early 1920s, Hastings Street was a thriving business district where Jews, African Americans, Greeks, and other Eastern Europeans lived and worked. And many of these new Jewish immigrants worked in unskilled labor in automobile plants, while many women in this community worked in cigar factories as well. So they're affected by some of these new laws in large part. There's a prevailing idea that the 1924 Immigration Act cut off Jewish and other Eastern European immigration, but quotas did not completely bar immigration. American immigration restrictions prompted tens of thousands like Isaac Chernin to travel to Canada, where American automobile employers had turned the Detroit Windsor region into this mighty industrial borderland. So Windsor's location, which was just a quick ferry ride just south of Detroit, really made it an ideal spot to build Canadian factories. So here are a couple of the branch plants that are established in Windsor, which are established in large part after the quotas take effect. So earlier in 1904, Ford Motor Company had built Ford of Canada, which was a factory that assembled Model Ts just across the Detroit River, and it was meant to avoid steep Canadian export tariffs and distribute cars tax-free across the British Empire. So it was already a kind of tax loophole. And Ford could do this because Windsor was so close. They could just ferry the auto bodies and the parts across the river and assemble them in Canada and then distribute the cars across the British Empire. But just a year after quotas took effect, so after quotas take effect, the Ford opened 2 more assembly plants and other automobile manufacturers follow. So by 1926, Studebaker, Hudson, Chrysler, and General Motors all had major branch plants in Windsor, and they employed a mixture of Anglo-Canadian and European-born workers. And soon, Windsor became a key destination for Europeans like Chernin, who could not get a quota visa, but wanted the promise of high wages in the automobile industry. So by 1927, over 40% of Windsor's residents worked at Ford of Canada, and another 20% worked for another automobile plant. So it's a very large percentage of people that are working for the automobile industry in Canada. And the system allowed major automobile manufacturers to avoid the different international export taxes while maintaining their access to inexpensive immigrant labor. So this is a specific, factories are specifically setting up branch plants across the border. But because wages in Windsor remained lower than those in Detroit, tens of thousands of immigrants used Windsor as a stopover in an unauthorized journey to the United States. So the unauthorized nature of this initial act aligned Europeans from Hungary, Poland, Italy, Greece, and Russia with a criminal world of smuggling and bootlegging. And newspapers even began to call immigrants who crossed this way bootlegged aliens. And this really associated new immigrants with an established smuggling industry that had long been an industry in Detroit, which was the liquor industry. So this label associated Jews and other Eastern Europeans with the liquor industry, which was already to some extent associated with Jewish Americans because of the Purple Gang in Detroit. And so at the time, the liquor industry in Detroit was controlled by a gang of second-generation Jewish immigrants from Russia. And they rose to power and distributed alcohol throughout the United States. They're known as one of the bloodiest gangs of its era. They killed nearly 500 rivals, and they trafficked their own liquor, but they also became famous for stopping other smugglers at gunpoint, shooting the driver, and taking the load. So they did not, of course, represent the majority of Jewish Detroiters, but I bring them up here because the presence of Jewish gangsters associated the Jewish community and population with liquor smuggling and this illegal activity in the eyes of many native-born Detroiters. And particularly groups like the Ku Klux Klan seized on this, and they said, oh, look, all the Jews are in Detroit are gangsters. They're all mobsters. Look, we have to get rid of them, even though the majority of Jewish Detroit was not affiliated with this at all. So soon Jews are associated rather unfairly with both liquor smuggling and unauthorized immigration. And so numbers of unsanctioned entries are really difficult to quantify, but local press and government reports suggest that between 1924 and 1939, between 7,000 and 10,000 immigrants crossed without authorization into Detroit each year. So the lure of jobs, or during the Depression, imagined jobs at major automobile companies, combined with Detroit's proximity to the Canadian border to make it the ideal destination for thousands of hopeful Europeans. And so, as you probably know, Detroit in the 1920s was just such a booming place. It was, it's often been compared to kind of the Silicon Valley. It was, by this point, had a huge population base and a world-class shopping, and just the jobs seemed to be endless. People lived in largely in single-family homes, and it was just many people wanted to come to Detroit from all backgrounds, from the South. Many African Americans came up from the South, white Americans came from the South, and immigrants came from across Eastern Europe, from the Middle East, and wanted to partake in what they saw as this booming Detroit and this land of opportunity. What they found didn't always match up with what their expectations had been. And I should also point out that Detroit is unique, of course, as you probably know, in that it represented America's largest industrial borderland. And so this demonstrates a phenomenon of illegal work and exploitation developing across the Midwest and across the North as well. So many immigrants who came in without papers used Detroit as a stopover. Some stayed, but some used Detroit as a stopover on their journeys to Cleveland, to Duluth, to Lansing, Chicago, or even to New York as well. It was this entry point that many people started to use. All right. So in this unique borderland, smugglers invented ingenious ways to keep themselves and their clients from being caught. So in addition to boats, planes, and trains, many provided their clients with forged passports and Canadian birth certificates, while other smugglers dressed immigrants in clothes sewn by American manufacturers. And this was meant to help them blend into American crowds. Smugglers also used unconventional means to transport immigrants across the Detroit-Windsor waterway, always attempting to stay one step ahead of border officials. Smugglers hid immigrants in everything from secret truck compartments to linen closets in Pullman railway cars. One group even succeeded in getting immigrants across in ventilated coffins. And in the winter, smugglers took advantage of Detroit's harsh climate. While the entire city was blanketed in snow and the St. Clair River was thick with ice, smugglers covered their clients here. I'll go back here. Smuggling. So smugglers covered their clients with sheets and guided them across the solid river. And Border Patrol and police referred to this practice as ghost walking. So they would cover themselves up with sheets. You couldn't see them at all. And so they were known as ghost walkers. And they complained, so officials complained that it was impossible to see these immigrants coming across the river against a backdrop of snow and ice. As smuggling rings grew in scope and ingenuity, many expanded abroad to solicit prospective immigrants in Europe. And between 1924 and 1929, officials discovered major smuggling gangs in Hamburg, Brussels, Paris, and Prague. And the Italian government even apprehended another group in Naples that had over 10,000 falsified passports hidden in this giant warehouse. And all of the passports said that the entry point was going to be Detroit. So again, there's this idea that Detroit is the place to go, the place to enter the United States if you're going to do it in an unconventional and unauthorized way. And so the newspaper in Windsor claimed that smugglers abroad waited outside American consulates and embassies to prey upon locals rejected by filled quotas. So again, there's this advertisement that starts with smugglers, but then continues through word of mouth across Eastern Europe, that people start to learn, well, if I connect myself with one of these smuggling rings, then it might be my only way to get into the United States. And many people had family in the United States and they wanted to visit, they had friends, and wanted to leave different places in Eastern Europe. So because American immigration quotas were often filled for the next 50 to 100 years, the smuggling rings represented prospective immigrants' only hope of reaching the United States. So, all right, here's Border Patrol. So increased illegal immigration forced policymakers to address the problem of border enforcement. So when Congress implemented the 1924 Immigration Act, it also appropriated $1 million for the establishment of a border patrol. And sheer numbers made 1920s policymakers more concerned with America's border with Canada than the southern border with Mexico. So in 1925, about 300,000 immigrants had entered the United States legally across the US-Canada border, whereas only 88,000 had crossed the US-Mexico border. So that just says that there's more traffic crossing the US-Canada border, and policymakers are naturally more worried about people crossing without papers across the US-Canada border at this time, because they feel like there are more people up there, there's more infrastructure, and it's just more likely that they're going to cross. And in fact, Border Patrol established its first outposts in Montreal, Niagara Falls, Detroit, Grand Forks, and Tacoma, while the southern border only had 3 outposts located in El Paso, Los Angeles, and San Antonio. And in Detroit, here, 50 officers patrolled the region from Port Huron up here in the north to Toledo all the way down in the south. And they bragged to each other and in reports that they caught an average of 200 Europeans each month. So after Border Patrol apprehended an immigrant, deportation proceedings ran with the efficiency of a traffic court, and they brought policing into the heart of the city. On December 17th, 1928, Border Patrol caught Abraham Levin, who was hidden in the trunk of a smuggler's car with 3 immigrants from Hungary, Greece, and Yugoslavia. And Levin is from Russia. After arresting the group, Border Patrol officers brought Levin to the Detroit police station, where the immigrant waited in a cell for 3 days before a brief hearing in front of an immigration inspector, which basically just sentenced him to deportation back to Russia on the steamship Dory. And deportations of men and women like Levin made the general public associate Jewish and other Eastern European immigrants and their entire neighborhoods with crime. So there's this growing association between new undocumented immigrants, people that had been stigmatized in the generation before, but now they have this label of illegality, of unsure legal status that kind of colors the entire neighborhood. And in 1929, an anonymous editorial from the Detroit News said, "Bootlegged aliens are being deported by the hundreds in our fair city. Imagine how many more are being harbored by their racial groups in dangerous ethnic enclaves." So again, there's this idea that there's this untold and kind of unseen number of unauthorized immigrants hiding across Detroit. In reality, there isn't. There's a handful of people here and there. The numbers are not super large, but the fear about undocumented immigrants is kind of starting to escalate at this time. And this is what's really going to take off and become really important for the politics that follow. So, as concerns over unauthorized immigrants spread across the city, nativist groups grow. The DAR, the Daughters of American Revolution, the Anti-Saloon League, and the American Legion here on the right, all lobbied against Southern Eastern Europeans with a particular focus on Eastern Europeans. And by 1925, Detroit's Ku Klux Klan gains popularity across the city with a membership of 50,000. The Detroit Klan was popular largely among white working class Detroiters, and it focused much of its energy on Catholic and Jewish immigrants. And from the mid-1920s to the early 1930s, white hooded Klansmen regularly lit burning crosses on the lawns of Catholic churches, or threw bricks with threats scrawled in blood or in red paint through the windows of synagogues. So this was something that was omnipresent in the lives of different, particularly Catholic and Jewish residents of Detroit at this time. And according to the Detroit Klan, it was impossible to determine whether a Pole, Russian, or Hungarian could be a bootlegged immigrant or criminal, meaning that all should be driven from the boundaries of the city and the nation. And so nativist campaigns really worked alongside law enforcement to popularize the idea that Southern Eastern Europeans, many of whom were Jewish, were backward, criminally inclined, and connected to illegality. This is all part of the rhetoric that's spreading and giving kind of more another thing for nativists to latch on to and to really emphasize at the time. And policymakers could not agree on how many unauthorized immigrants entered the United States after restrictive laws. But by the Great Depression, estimates over numbers of undocumented immigrants who held and undocumented workers who are holding on to precious American jobs starts to skyrocket. So we see these huge kind of overly exaggerated numbers. In Washington, a group called the American Coalition, the nativist organization, stoked fears over illegal immigrants by fabricating impossible numbers of unauthorized immigrants and distributing them across the United States. So while in 1930, there were probably 10,000 undocumented immigrants in Detroit and maybe 300,000 across the nation, the American Coalition speculated that 2 million illegals had entered the United States since 1924, and they're using this language here. And it reported that these immigrants were predisposed to engage in prostitution, to steal, to traffic liquor, and to murder specifically. And with so many unauthorized immigrants, it stood to reason that a good proportion were stealing jobs from what they called more deserving Protestant Americans. So they're very clear about who they are casting as deserving Americans here. So in Detroit, during the Depression era, the city's major union, the Detroit Federation of Labor, sided with the nativists in this case. A fact that, and this really alienated a lot of foreign-born immigrants from unions in general and would for a while. So the Detroit Federation of Labor was a subsidiary of the larger American Federation of Labor, and it represented skilled and semi-skilled workers. So it's not yet representing the unskilled workers of the automobile industry, which is most of the new immigrants are part of that group, not all. And its leaders resented undocumented workers because they thought that they lowered wages, flooded the labor market, and had a history of breaking strikes. So instead of attacking Briggs Body Company or Hudson's Department Store, which were both employers that were notorious for favoring undocumented workers, the DFL chose to wage a campaign against the immigrants themselves. And so the first of these campaigns is a campaign against day laborers from Canada. So in 1926, and I'll turn over here. So in 1926, about 10,000 immigrants had commuted daily from Windsor for jobs in Detroit every day. So many, many people were living in Detroit and would cross on the ferry each day. Half of these were Eastern Europeans, many of whom were Jewish. And as the union started to lobby against them, they basically get the Eastern Europeans and anyone who's not a Canadian citizen barred from commuting. So by 1927, within about a year, there are 5,000 commuters who are allowed to commute. But the Detroit Federation of Labor is still not happy with this. They really want to just halt the practice entirely. The head of the Detroit Federation of Labor, a man named Frank Martel, becomes kind of obsessed with this. It becomes his kind of major campaign. He's constantly writing about commuters and how they're undermining the labor movement to an extent to which the head of the AFL in Washington writes to him and says, look, you need to lay off. This is not that big a deal. But he continues on and is ultimately successful. He couldn't get the organization to bar the British and Canadian migrants who had crossed daily for years. So in response, the Detroit Federation of Labor turns toward nativist rhetoric that by this time would have been very familiar to local Detroiters. So even though most of the commuters who are still commuting are Anglo-Canadians, the DFL portrays the group as, they call them swarthy, they call them un-American and too foreign, and they cause the Immigration and Naturalization Service to begin turning commuters away at the Detroit ferry docks. And this is some of I have this cartoon in here because it gives you an idea of the way they're casting immigrant commuters. And again, keep in mind that most of the actual commuters who are coming across are Anglo-Canadians, but here it says foreign on this man's arm. And the picture here isn't very good, but his skin is very dark here, and he's easily able to cross the Windsor border. And this is Order 86, which is the Immigration and Naturalization Order that's allowing them to continue crossing the border. And so the campaign against commuters reached a head in 1927 when 7 Canadians from Windsor filed an injunction against the Immigration and Naturalization Service. To represent their case, the men recruited a New York attorney, an attorney from New York named Eli Goldsmith, and he boarded a train for Detroit and took their case. But he'd really failed to grasp the intense anger towards foreigners that was developing in Detroit at this time. 3 of the 7 men Goldsmith represented had dark complexions and spoke with foreign accents. 2 were of Polish origin, 1 was of Russian origin. And when immigration inspectors interrogated them during their Board of Special Inquiry hearing, they focused on the foreignness. And on their foreignness, so they asked them all these questions and focused on their accents, and they're very clear that they're troubled by this group because they seem too foreign. And so after a quick deliberation, they bar all 7 of these men. And after this, the Detroit Federation of Labor begins to portray Goldsmith as a foreigner himself, using anti-Semitic tropes to claim that he represented, quote, the corrupting influences of foreign outsiders. And here's a political cartoon again in the Detroit Federation, or the Detroit Labor News, which is the DFL's newspaper, that portrays Goldsmith as a bully. Here he has a sheriff's star. He's the sheriff in town. When he has this big stick, it's the injunction that's bullying Uncle Sam. So again, there's this anti-Semitic trope that we see, the Jewish lawyer coming from New York, and he's a foreigner. He's not part of this Anglo-Saxon establishment the Detroiters are trying to maintain in the city. All right. And in 1931, the Detroit Federation of Labor, I'm not sure why the photo isn't showing up here. I'm really sorry. I had a photo of the Detroit Federation of Labor with their campaign. The Detroit Federation of Labor backed a state campaign to register all foreign-born individuals in Detroit. And so to gain popular support, I'll just move back here, to gain popular support from Michigan's employers who remained wary of immigration restrictions, the DFL claimed that registering all alien workers would check communist influence in the city. And the registration drive served to shift unions and nativist organizations focused from unauthorized immigrants to the legal immigrants living in Michigan. So now we have people that are legal, people that many of whom are American citizens, but might have a brother or sister who doesn't have papers yet. They're dealing with this idea of registering with the state. And people are very concerned about having to go register as a non-citizen and having to give fingerprints to the state of Michigan as well. This is a big concern. And so by late 1931, despite a growing protest from groups like the ACLU, the law passed. And Michigan becomes the first state to require foreign-born residents to carry proof of citizenship at all times. giving police yet another reason to stop and arrest foreigners in ethnic neighborhoods across the city. And I'll note here also that the registration drive corresponds with the rise of the notorious and very anti-Semitic radio priest, Father Charles Coughlin, whose weekly radio broadcast linking Jews to communism had millions of listeners. And the Detroiters that were targeted by this new law lodged their protest immediately. The Communist Party was one of the biggest opponents of the law. And in 1931, the secretary of the National Communist Party, William Foster, traveled to Detroit and lobbied against what he called the blacklist alien registration law. And I'll move to the next slide here. So this one, it is showing up perfect. So Jewish leaders also spoke out against the registration law. Popular Rabbi Leon Fram of Reform Temple Bethel insisted the law would only bring, quote, Tsarism, terror, blackmail, and extortion to Detroit's foreign-born communities. But Jewish and communist protests provided a fodder for nativists. The KKK insisted that registering immigrants could stop the spread of isms, by which he meant, or by which they meant communism, Semitism, and Catholicism. And they say these things over in a list many times to kind of emphasize that one could be interchanged with the other, so that they're all kind of one and the same. And they tried to basically cast protests to the new law as a fringe movement supported by a handful of ethnic and religious minorities. Most immigrant and second generation Americans begin to feel deeply uncomfortable with registering and fingerprinting with the state government. And they blame the Detroit Federation of Labor for casting them and for making them do this and for making them, for lobbying against them in general. So ultimately, the union's participation in the registration campaign caused many immigrants, legal or not, to become suspicious of unions and to choose to support the employers who at the very least offered them work. So for instance, Frank Janisweski, who was the editor of the Detroit Polish Daily News, urged his readers to avoid unions and to remain open shop, a choice that earned him the support and friendship of leaders at Ford, Chrysler, and Hudson Motor Companies. And this became really important in 1933 during the Briggs Motor Company strike, which is one of the first strikes that attempts to organize the automobile industry, and it ultimately fails because Southern Eastern Europeans are wary of the union and are wary of the union movement that they feel has not supported them. So what happens is that in January of 1933, 2 weeks after FDR's inauguration, workers went on strike at Briggs Body Company. And the company was owned by industrialist Walter Briggs, who was the famed owner of the Detroit Tigers. And the company had a reputation for dangerous working conditions, low wages, and because of this, it employed a large number of African Americans and unauthorized Europeans as well. We don't know the exact makeup of the workforce. But back in 1927, on a sweltering June afternoon, thousands of workers in the Briggs Mack Avenue plant were spraying automobile bodies with flammable chemicals, and a broken lamp tipped over, which caused an explosion that engulfed the entire warehouse in flames. The fire could have been avoided with more ventilation and some simple workplace precautions, but it killed 21 workers and blinded 15 others. Making matters worse, Walter Briggs kept the incident quiet and paid off mainstream newspapers, policemen, and the fire department to downplay the issue. To grieving widows or to the survivors who left the blast with permanent injuries, Briggs denied the incident entirely. And he said that missing workers had perhaps never come to the plant that day, and that the injured were just dramatizing a routine workplace fire. But Briggs continued to deny the incident and insisted on offering the lowest wages in the city. So each morning, the industrialists left Stonehenge, which was his 9,000 square foot English Manor style mansion, and it's in the Boston Edison neighborhood in Detroit. And he passed through lush gardens and this kind of giant wrought iron gate on his way to his office in Highland Park. In contrast, he paid his workers too little to afford any more than the tiniest room in Detroit's overcrowded East Side neighborhoods. So in 1927, he offered women 21 cents and men 35 cents an hour and refused to pay workers for idle time between shifts or jobs. So when the Depression began, Briggs lowered wages to 5 or 10 cents. And this made Briggs kind of a last resort. And this attracted many African-American workers and many immigrants who had recently arrived in Detroit, many of whom probably had no entry papers and did not have citizenship. So labor leaders called Briggs a slaughterhouse, and ordinary workers joked, if poison doesn't work, try Briggs. There are all these jokes about how it's the worst job in the city. So when a handful of workers put down their tools in protest, no one really had to ask why. There was no question. At its height, 12,000 workers actively struck, and about 100,000 workers could not work because Ford Motor Company had to close a lot of its plants when it couldn't get automobile bodies. So Briggs provided Ford with a lot of the automobile bodies for their cars as well. So the strike's important because it marked the first time skilled and unskilled laborers in the automobile industry came together to strike. And historians often kind of see it as the beginning of organizing the auto industry, but it was also a failure. Walter Briggs imported strike breakers and resumed production. The striking workers either lost their jobs or had to return without any pay increases. And a major contributing factor to the Briggs strike's failure was actually the fact that immigrant workers, even legal ones, shied from the picket lines. And as Walter Briggs began importing strike breakers and police targeted picketers who looked foreign, many immigrant workers resumed work as strike breakers. Some may have been undocumented, and others may have harbored resentment towards unions for their role in trying to register the foreign-born Michiganders. The DFL had been involved in the strike and had taken on, hadn't started it, but had taken on the campaign on behalf of the strike and was very active in lobbying for the strikers. So again, a lot of foreign-born Detroiters were wary of this. And it's also important to remember that even legal immigrant workers often had an undocumented mother, a wife, or a brother at home, and they may have feared for their safety as well. So when the loss finally set in, strikers attempted to derive lessons from this 3-month ordeal, and leaders conceded that the strike's main failure was that the organization had not done enough to reduce discrimination against foreign-born workers. That's what they come up with. And this will be a major lesson to the United Auto Workers and the UAW when they finally come together and form the UAW, because they specifically reach out to foreign-born workers, particularly to Eastern Europeans at the time. All right, so moving on. So Ford Motor Company, the largest employer in the Detroit border region, also had a history of employing undocumented immigrants. In the deportation records of the US National Archives, hundreds of immigrants admitted they worked at Ford. So for instance, Tanka Sucharina, who is a woman from Poland, said that after coming to the United States from Poland, she spent a full year working as a punch press at the River Rouge plant. And she said she earned $57 every 2 weeks, and which was less than a native-born, naturalized, or legal worker, but she was pleased with it and proud of it. And in her deportation hearing, Sucharina claimed that though this was lower than the $5 a day promised to native-born workers, it was certainly higher than anything she expected in her hometown of Chotliab, where upon her return, she faced a famine and eventually war. So because they did not have papers, Suchervina and thousands of other immigrants worked for little pay. They faced first layoffs in times of depression, and they lived in constant fear of deportation. And board executives actually even started to stage public deportations to keep immigrants and ethnic workers in check. So in the spring of 1932, as the Communist Party gained popularity across the city, Harry Bennett, who is the head of the Ford Service Department, kind of strong arm of Ford Motor Company, he negotiated a series of raids with the Immigration Service that had 500 immigrants deported from an immigrant heavy region next to Ford Motor Company in Dearborn. In one particular instance, the Ford Service Department allowed immigration inspectors to handcuff and drag a Russian Jewish worker, in this case, off the shop floor as a quote unquote alien suspect, he was later returned to work, but it was a clear message to workers on the assembly line who considered demanding higher wages or more hours as well. So there's this, they're trying to instill fear by using deportation, by using the Immigration and Naturalization Service in this case. And at Ford and other industries across the city, managers and foremen promoted this underground labor system because immigrant workers were less expensive and they're easier to extort. All right. And so I'm going to move to, here. Okay. So immigration, of course, here we have immigration in Detroit in the 1920s, but immigration is once again at the forefront of American policies, and pundits are constantly talking about immigration. But newscasters act like America's immigration crisis is in California or Texas, far from the lives of kind of ordinary Midwesterners. Really, the Midwest, and Michigan in particular, has a long history of unauthorized immigration. And maybe some of your own family members could have crossed into the United States in rowboats, crouching down and shaking because they were afraid of being found by the Border Patrol. So again, this is part of, I urge everyone to think about the long history of unauthorized immigration in the United States and how Detroit fits into this narrative that we see here. Here's Detroit in the 1920s. This is Texas in the 1980s. And here we see California, San Diego in 2018, where we have Mexican immigrants crossing the border here, and then eventually Central Americans crossing the border and asking for asylum coming into the United States. And so I'll end here, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have about my work and anything else about Detroit in the 1920s and 30s as well. Thank you so much. I'll stop the share.
Thank you very much. We actually did have a question that recently came through over the chat, so we'll start with that one. How long did immigrants to Canada need to wait to apply for Canadian citizenship?
That's a great question. So they had to wait, so they could apply. So that's a couple of parts. So immigrants could for a little while, they could go to Canada for a couple of years. They could go to Canada and get Canadian residency and then cross into the United States after 2 years. But after by 1928, the Immigration and Naturalization Service kind of wises up to this practice and realizes that many people are living in Toronto or Windsor and then waiting the time. And so they had to wait 5 years and apply as US or as Canadian citizens. And in some cases, even if they had Canadian citizenship, the United States would still categorize them as Polish or Russian, depending on their nation of origin. Oh, sorry, I can't hear you.
Sorry, I muted my microphone. Any other questions, please submit them via the chat. Where did you do your research and what archives were most helpful?
That's a great question. And so I started this project at the Immigration and Naturalization in the Immigration and Naturalization Service records, which are in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And I started this. Some people ask me why I decided to study Detroit. I did not start this project as a Detroit historian. I was just interested in immigration in this time period. And so I started looking in the catalog of the INS papers, and it turned out that Detroit was the place that had the most entries. And that seemed strange to me and surprising. And so, as so many research papers and kind of dissertations and books start with this kind of, well, that seems weird, right? That doesn't kind of mesh with my idea about what immigration was in the 1920s and 30s. So I headed to the National Archives and started working there. And that's where there are tons of, there's the Border Patrol papers, there are papers about different immigration stations, and there are also deportation records. So that's where you find the stories of actual people who have been deported and their stories. In Detroit, I've spent a lot of time at the Reuther Library, and I spent time at the Bentley Historical Library in Ann Arbor, and the Detroit Public Library, the collection there as well.
Did the immigrants coming from Montreal come for the same reasons as the ones that entered from Windsor during that same time period?
So a lot of people would go to Montreal first and work there for a little while and then continue on to Windsor. It's not always, it's hard to kind of figure out whether people are coming and coming to Canada with the express intention of coming to the United States, or in some cases they can't go to the United States, so they get a ticket to Canada, and maybe they don't find that the opportunities are as great as they were hoping there. Maybe they hear that there's a larger and Polish or Jewish community in places in the United States, and they want to join family or friends, and then they end up finding ways into the United States. So it's hard to know whether people are trying. Sometimes they say in their immigration records, but usually it's just kind of this story of, well, someone ends up here and then ends up here, and then has kind of moved along and picked up often and exploited by smugglers as well. There are many cases in which smugglers are telling immigrants about opportunities that don't exist, saying during the Depression, saying, oh, you'll be able to get a job in Detroit, no problem, which is false.
Can you compare immigration in the 1920s to present immigration?
Oh, can I compare? So I think there are a lot. I mean, it's difficult to compare because the politics of the time period are very different. Politics of the border are very different. But I think the comparison that I do see is that we have certain immigrant groups in the 1920s, usually Eastern Europeans, Jewish immigrants, Catholic immigrants, who are being categorized as potentially illegal, are having to justify their status and existence in the United States, even if they are legal immigrants or are US citizens. And you see a similar development along the southwest border as well, in which people of Latino origin are off in some cases, in particular places on the southwest border, forced to justify their status, justify their Americanness, justify their right to be in the United States. So those are some of the parallels. And then just sometimes the ways they're getting in across the border as well. And the fact that they're being associated in the 1920s with illegal liquor smuggling, whereas today a lot of undocumented immigrants are being associated or kind of crossing over with the paths of kind of drug smugglers as well.
Were smugglers ever arrested or punished for their illegal activity?
Yes, they were. So in some cases, some good tests or some really interesting testimony I've seen is some immigrants will agree to testify against smugglers and say, what happened, who took them across the border. And so the Border Patrol is, in particular, later in the 1920s and into the 1930s, is really focused on trying to catch smugglers. But if the smugglers are Canadian, they usually just end up deporting them back to Canada. If they're in the United States, then they prosecute them. And eventually, if they're not citizens of the United States, in 1930, liquor prohibition smuggling liquor is turned into a felony in the United States. And this is specifically to be able to deport undocumented Europeans or deport legal Europeans who may have committed a crime. And so they'll often charge them with liquor smuggling, even if they can't prove that they're smuggling people, and there are all sorts of things that happen, but they are charged, and they try, and the INS spends a lot of time, as does the Border Patrol, with trying to catch different major smuggling rings.
Just a reminder, if there are any other questions, please submit them via the chat, and we'll just wait a few minutes to see if anything else comes through. What are you working on now?
Right now, I'm working on a book on early Middle Eastern immigration to the Midwest, looking at different Syrian Christian, Syrian Muslim groups coming to Detroit, but also across the entire Midwest, and looking at how they're forging a place in industrial America.
And again, any other questions, please submit them via the chat. I am not seeing any questions come through. So thank you so much for your presentation tonight. We really, really appreciate it. It was super educational and very, appropriate for, where we are located. And a lot of us, I think this really is a lot of people's history. We hope that you will all tune in again soon for one of our upcoming presentations and join us to dine in or carry out from Steve's Deli. And thank you again, Ashley Johnson Bavery. We really appreciate it. We will see you all soon. Have a great night. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.